Ireland's next big star makes his second appearance with the UFC following up a big-time first-round knockout win over Jordan Williams. We're talking about the former Cage Warriors welterweight champ, the future Ian Garry, the recently married Ian Garry.
Congrats.
Going over to Vegas, getting married to Layla and Ali, and now we're here training out of Sanford MMA is Garry. He's had the last couple of camps over there, and in his UFC debut, bit of a mixed bag. I mean, he did knock out Jordan Williams in the first round. He received a lot of punishment in that first round. We'll talk about that one quite a bit. But he's taken on Darian Weeks out of Hewlett House, Missouri's own. And when you look at it for Darian Weeks, very well-rounded skill set. Maybe takedown defense isn't the strongest bit of his game, but offensive takedowns and offensive wrestling coupled with very, very good boxing and a tidy little leg kick bring everything together for Darian Weeks. And he got a short notice opportunity back in December to make his UFC debut against Bryan Barberena. Was able to get the second round somewhat convincingly, I would say. First round was pretty damn close, and in the third round, Bryan Barberena really kicked it into high gear. But for Darian Weeks, you got to consider this too. He went from fighting not the highest level of competition on the regional scene, and I think you can't talk about that enough. His fight to come into the UFC was against 3-4 Craig Fairley, and I don't know what Craig Fairley and Dustin Parrish before him on Mr. Weeks' record had, just this affinity for leg locks, but they kept trying leg locks. And you can't get Darian Weeks out of there by leg locks. So I don't know if John Danaher was on speed dial for the camps of those guys, but Weeks able to get out of some of those compromising positions. And even in the fight against Parrish where he gets taken down, he gets dominated, he ends up reversing position as that fight went on and really poured on the pressure. So for Darian Weeks, very interesting prospect. Obviously for Ian Garry, a lot of hype. He's able to get that win in Cage Warriors to book his ticket against Jack Grant to win the belt, decision win there. To end up into the UFC, Jack Grant, lightweight, but still, Ian Garry, uber prospect, and a lot of people are hot and heavy on Garry.
Gary's so hot right now. For Darian Weeks, it is unfortunate because, like you said, he's one of these guys who looked really impressive against guys who, let's be honest, he probably should have beat on the regional scene. And then he was getting thrown in against Bryan Barberena. Someone who, yes, there's question marks, but mainly just surrounding, medically Barberena.
Tuesday of Fight Week, he gets that call.
Exactly, and he did make a fairly good account of himself. I didn't think he won the fight, but he made it competitive against a good fighter in Bryan Barberena. Maybe not someone who we think is a top-tier fighter at 170, but still, if you have a competitive fight with someone like Barberena, there is a spot for you in the UFC, and that's something we can all agree on. The big issue with Weeks, though, and you kind of alluded to this at the start of the video, is that Weeks' big Achilles heel in his whole game is his wrestling defense. And I know people are pretty fired up about Ian Garry because he got a knockout his last time out, but Ian Garry is a phenomenal grappler, and he's somebody who, when he does get on top, makes you pay for every second you are on the ground under him. I see a lot of the, narrative this week just being about how Garry, have you seen his hands and how good his boxing is? I don't expect Ian Garry to beat a lot of top fighters just with his boxing at the UFC. I really do think he is going to have to implement his grappling a lot more when he does start to fight the upper echelon guys, but that's a great thing to do. He's a phenomenal grappler. He has good submission wins, great ground and pound though, and that really is Ian Garry. It might not be his specialty, but that's the one area of his game that I do like the most because it just wears on his opponent. It's an offensive tool that also drains your opponent and makes them a lesser version of themselves later on. So for Garry, I like him on the feet early on in the fight with his straight shots in his boxing. It will be interesting, though, if Weeks goes to the body of Ian Garry, because Ian Garry's as big of a welterweight as you can possibly be. And we were talking about this before we started filming. Him and Luke Rockhold are the only two guys in the UFC I can think of who it's their only goal is to stand up as straight as possible. Jordan Wright, I guess we can throw him in that category too. It's just not really, those aren't guys you want to be in a category with. And for Ian Garry, it does worry me. It's when you have non-shooters on the court in basketball, it affects everything else to a certain degree because you don't have to worry about that guy as far away anymore. So we can all sort of focus on the people who do matter and who can shoot. For Ian Garry, when you stand up really straight, it might not immediately be an issue, but it's going to start to show holes later on when you start to fight upper echelon guys. If Ian Garry fought, let's say even a Santiago Ponzinibbio. I know he's a good fighter, but he's a little bit older now. He's not ranked anymore. Santiago could kick his leg apart, go to the body with his hooks, and really make him pay for some of those defensive lapses that he does have. But I'm really excited to see what version of Ian Garry we get in this fight, and if we do see the overall wrestling package of his game, because I feel like people will really start to believe in Ian Garry as a UFC prospect, and I know he has hype right now, but I genuinely do think there's another level that they could take it to if he does go out there and have maybe a Jack Shore, Timur Valiev type fight, where he's tested, he has to really dig deep and come on strong later on. I think that's the type of performance performance that would really get people on an Ian Garry hype train.
I see this fight being a grind. I don't love the odds, and I wouldn't anchor a damn thing to Ian Garry. And I bought into the hype coming in fighting Jordan Williams because Williams, what does he do? Well, he strikes, but he struggles with striking defense. And when you can really rock him, like, he gets wobbled and hurt fairly easily. And Williams just goes out there, crowds that distance, chases him around the cage, and doesn't necessarily even cut it. But Gary's just on the back foot, deer in the headlights, standing straight up, eating a lot of punishment. And Williams was able to mix it up well to the body and to the head. So it's one of those things that I do worry about Ian Garry now, even against a guy like, you might not have even heard of Darian Weeks. You're just a fan of Ian Garry and you found us. I'm not as sold on Ian Garry. Now, again, Garry started boxing at the age of 10. He's a judo black belt. We see these things implemented in his game plan. So, again, he does have a great basis. He has moved his camp over to Sanford MMA, training with Jason Jackson. Again, you see Mickey Gall over there. We already touched on it. Yaroslav Amosov fighting for his country, pulling belts out of burning buildings. Like, that's kind of crazy. But Amosov, another guy that, while he was at Sanford, you would have gotten an opportunity to train with him as well. So,
think how much better that would make you, too, training with a guy like Amosov. Like, he's good on the feet. He never gets tired, and he's a great wrestler. Kind of the perfect guy to train with every day.
Wild stuff. So, Matt, we look at this fight, and for Ian Garry, he, again, a giant favorite. Open to minus 185. He's a minus 360. For Darian Weeks, open to plus 155. He's a plus 280. If we have a look at the Tapology votes, and they were a surprise to us, there to you, Matt. I'm going to say 90% Ian Garry, over-under.
I'll say over.
You're going to say over? Ooh, just over. Look at that. 1,758 total votes, 92% Garry, 75% by knockout for the 8% that have Weeks, 52% by knockout. Matt, I think this fight is going to go to a decision, so I disagree with all of the voters out there. I think Ian Garry will get the win, but man, I would not be surprised. Darian Weeks has some really, really crisp boxing, great 1-2, great right hand, good ability with his leg kicks as well. I think this is a really tough test for Ian Garry.
I do too. I think he's going to be able to win this fight. Now, I could see him winning by finish. I'm not going to say finish or decision. I do think he's going to be able to win, but I do think Darian Weeks is being overlooked. I don't think you can take a lot out of his last performance against Bryan Barberena because he has so much stacked against him in that fight that it was borderline ridiculous if we're being honest. But I do like Weeks' ability to switch it up on the feet, and I do think body shots are going to be a really interesting thing just going along in the career of Ian Garry. He's huge for the weight class, shows a lot of his body, and he's not someone who's like really built up a lot in their midsection, so I'm really curious to see if body shots do affect him.
Me.
But like, okay, Earl Spence Jr. is fighting Ugas in a week, and that's the big conversation of that fight. Like, can Earl Spence eat the body shots of Ugas? He's built in a very similar way to a guy like Ian Garry, so it's just coming to mind. That's why I'm bringing it up right now. I'm curious to see if Garry will be able to strike with the upper echelon guys like Eliseo Zaleski dos Santos would be a really fun opponent for him if he's able to beat Darian Weeks. That'd be a good opponent next. So I think Gary's going to be able to get the win, but this is a tough fight.
Aleksei, we want you, but it'll probably be Benoit Saint Denis if we're being honest. Big time opportunity for both of these guys, Matt. Both of us going with Ireland's Ian Garry, but not with the confidence of the almost 4-1 favorite that he is right now. Let us know down below in the comments section who you have, because I threw this one out there on Twitter, and there were a lot of people that were talking about Darian Weeks in this opportunity. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, and as we always say,
let's get into it.